Abraham Lincoln is perhaps the most scrutinized human being in American history. We know his shoe size, his favorite poems, the intimate details of his melancholy, and every political maneuver he executed to save the Union. But for over 150 years, a massive, shadowy void has existed at the very center of his identity. It concerns the woman who gave him life, Nancy Hanks Lincoln. Abraham himself was notoriously tight-lipped about his mother's side of the family, once allegedly telling his law partner William Herndon that his mother was the illegitimate daughter of a Virginia nobleman. For over a century, historians have fought over this claim, digging through dusty courthouses and crumbling family Bibles. But now, the debate has shifted from paper to the laboratory. Scientists have finally utilized advanced mitochondrial DNA testing to map the maternal ancestry of Nancy Hanks, and the results have sent a massive shockwave through the world of genealogy. What the DNA revealed about where Lincoln truly came from isn't just surprising, it is deeply unsettling because it pulls back the curtain on a hidden, chaotic world of frontier survival that turns the traditional Lincoln legend completely on its head. To understand why this DNA discovery is so heavy, we have to look at the mystery through Lincoln's own eyes. Imagine being the most powerful man in the country, yet secretly fearing that your very blood was a source of shame. Lincoln was haunted by the idea of his mother's origins. Nancy Hanks passed away when Abe was just 9 years old, leaving him with vague stories and a sense of profound loss. The rumors that followed her were relentless. Was she the product of a high society scandal in Virginia? Was she related to the wealthy Hanks families of New England? Or was she related to the wealthy Hanks families of New England, as some whispered in the backwoods of Kentucky, the result of something much darker and more complicated? For decades, the Hanks name was a labyrinth of contradictions. There were dozens of Nancy Hankses living at the same time, and pinpointing which one was the mother of the 16th president was a genealogical nightmare. The breakthrough came when researchers decided to stop looking at names and start looking at the genetic code that is passed down exclusively from mother to child, mitochondrial DNA. Because this specific type of DNA remains largely unchanged through the maternal line for thousands of years. It acts like a biological GPS. By testing documented female line descendants of the various Hanks branches, scientists hoped to find the signature of Nancy. What they found, however, was a genetic profile that didn't fit the established narrative of a simple, pioneer immigrant family from England. The DNA results indicated a lineage that was incredibly rare in the colonial United States. Instead of the typical European haplogroup signatures found in the vast majority of settlers in Virginia and the Carolinas, Nancy's maternal line showed markers that pointed toward a deeply isolated and ancient pocket of the British Isles, with traces of genetic drift that suggested her ancestors had lived on the extreme fringes of society for generations. This wasn't the lineage of a Virginia nobleman. This was something much more visceral. The data suggested that Nancy Hanks came from a line of people who were essentially the invisible inhabitants of early America. These were people who lived outside the law, outside the church. But the DNA went even further. When scientists compared the Lincoln maternal samples to broader databases, they found an unexpected proximity to lineages often associated with the very earliest migrant groups of the Appalachian frontier. We are talking about the Melungeon, or triracial isolate communities. These were groups of people who emerged in the 17th and 18th centuries, often a complex blend of European, African, and indigenous American ancestry, who were pushed into the most rugged, inaccessible parts of the mountains to escape the rigid racial and social hierarchies of the coast. If Nancy Hanks belonged to such a group, it means Abraham Lincoln, the great emancipator, was himself a product of the very multicultural struggle he would eventually spend his life navigating. This genetic reality creates a massive conflict with the log cabin myth we are taught in school. We like to think of the Lincolns as the quintessential white pioneer family. But the DNA suggests a much more gray reality. It hints at a family history filled with intentional obscurity. Why did Nancy's mother, Lucy Hanks, face such intense legal scrutiny in Kentucky? Why was she indicted for fornication by a grand jury? In the context of this new DNA evidence, these weren't just random acts of a rebellious woman. They were the symptoms of a family trying to survive on the margins of a society that didn't have a legal category for them. The disturbing nature of this find lies in the realization of how much effort went into hiding these tracks. For over a century, various Hanks descendants attempted to clean up the family tree to make it more acceptable for a presidential lineage. They fabricated links to wealthy families in England and tried to pretend that Nancy's mother was a saintly figure of high birth. But the DNA doesn't lie. It shows a rugged, difficult path through the wilderness. It shows a maternal line that was subjected to extreme hardship and social exclusion. When you look at Lincoln's face, those deep-set eyes, the high cheekbones, and that towering idiosyncratic frame, people always wondered where those features came from. His father, Thomas Lincoln, was a stout, square-built man of classic English stock. The DNA implies that Abraham's distinctive physicality was a gift from this mysterious maternal line. He was a biological outlier, because his mother's people were social outliers. He carried the physical and genetic echoes of people who had been surviving in the deep woods and mountain hollows since the 1600s. This shift in our understanding of Lincoln's mother also changes how we interpret his famous bouts of hypochondria, or what we now call clinical depression. We know he suffered from a persistent gloom that he referred to as his melancholy. If his maternal line was part of an isolated, persecuted frontier group, the trauma of that social exclusion may have been baked into his upbringing. Nancy Hanks lived a life of constant movement and suspicion. She was born in an era where her own mother was a social pariah. Imagine the psychological weight of that heritage being passed down to a sensitive, highly intelligent boy like Abraham. The DNA reveals that he wasn't just fighting for the soul of the country. He was fighting a personal war against a heritage of shame that the genetic record proves was very real. The scientists who conducted this research had to navigate a minefield of ethical and political concerns. Testing the remains or descendants of a national icon is never simple. But the push for the truth was fueled by a desire to see the real Lincoln. The results showed that Nancy's DNA belonged to haplogroup X, a group that is notoriously difficult to track because it is so thin on the ground. Group X is often found in small ancient populations in the Near East and parts of Europe, but its presence in the American backwoods in the late 1700s is a massive neon sign pointing toward a non-standard history. It suggests her female ancestors didn't just hop on a boat from London in the 1750s. They were likely part of a much earlier, perhaps even 17th century arrival that had spent over 100 years drifting through the wilderness, losing their names and their status along the way. Think about the sheer scale of the landscape these people were moving across. This wasn't a nature project in a park. This was a struggle across a continental wilderness that wanted to swallow people whole. The DNA proves that Nancy's ancestors were the ultimate survivors. They survived the brutal winters of the Blue Ridge Mountains and the violent clashes of the colonial frontier. But they paid a price. The price was their identity. They became the Hankses, a name that became synonymous with mystery and frustration for every historian who tried to track them. The most unsettling part of the DNA study is the implication of what historians call social death. This is when a group of people is so marginalized that they effectively cease to exist in official records. They don't have birth certificates, they don't have land deeds, and they are buried in unmarked spots. For Nancy Hanks to have emerged from such a background and raised a son who would become the most eloquent writer in American history is a miracle of human potential. But it also exposes a darker side of the American project, the thousands of others who were part of that same genetic and social struggle, but who never got a voice. This research also helps explain why the Lincoln-Hanks connection was so fraught with tension. When Lincoln was a member of Congress and later a candidate for the presidency, his opponents tried to use his low birth against him. They whispered that his mother was waste timber. These weren't just insults, they were coded attacks on her perceived otherness. In the 19th century, people were obsessed with bloodlines and purity. The DNA evidence we have now suggests that his enemies were sensing something that was biologically true. Lincoln didn't come from the same stock as the Virginia planter elite like Washington or Jefferson. He was something new, something forged in the muddy, multi-ethnic, chaotic reality of the deep frontier. As we analyze the mitochondrial markers further, we see evidence of a population bottleneck. This happens when a small group of people becomes isolated and breeds within a limited pool for a long time. The Hanks DNA shows some of these signs. This points toward the communities the mother of Lincoln came from being tightly knit and suspicious of outsiders. This would have been a world of profound secrecy. Imagine growing up in a home where your mother's past is a forbidden subject, not because she did anything wrong, but because her very existence was a challenge to the white status quo of the time. The DNA results also forced a re-evaluation of the Berry and Shipley families who were long thought to be the maternal aunts of Nancy. The genetic testing showed that some of these traditionally accepted relationships were actually impossible. This means that for over 100 years, the official family tree in textbooks was a work of fiction. Whole branches of the Lincoln family tree have been lopped off by this DNA study, replaced by a void that scientists are still trying to fill. We are left with a Nancy Hanks who is even more alone than we thought. She wasn't part of a big organized clan moving west. She was part of a small, fragile thread of DNA, trying to maintain a foothold in a world that didn't value her. But why use the word disturbing? It is disturbing because it forces us to acknowledge that the person who might be the most American of all of us was partially the product of a history we tried to bury. We want our heroes to have clear, noble paths. We want to be able to trace them back to a specific village in England or a specific ship. When the DNA says no, this person came from a group of people we tried to forget, it makes us uncomfortable. It challenges our notions of what the American nature really is. It shows that the frontier wasn't just a place of rugged individuals. It was a place of lost peoples and hidden heritages. The biological data also hints at the physical toll of this lifestyle. Mitochondrial DNA is often studied in relation to metabolic health and energy. The specific markers in Nancy's line are associated with high-stress environments. These were people whose bodies were tuned for the fight-or-flight reality of the wilderness. When Lincoln spoke of his tired feeling that never left him, he may have been describing a genetic legacy of generations of extreme stress and survival. He wasn't just carrying the weight of the war, he was carrying the biological exhaustion of the Appalachian maternal line that the DNA proves was pushed to the absolute limit. For those interested in the sheer scale of the American landscape, consider the movement of this DNA. It started in some ancient pocket of the British Isles, perhaps among the border reivers or the displaced mountain folk of Wales. It crossed the Atlantic in the holds of cramped ships. It moved through the tidewater of Virginia, then over the Cumberland Gap, into the dark and bloody ground of Kentucky, then across the Ohio River into the brutal winters of Indiana, and finally into the prairies of Illinois. This DNA is a map of the American westward expansion in its most raw, unvarnished form. It isn't a map of glory, it is a map of a desperate search for a place to simply exist. The findings have also caused a stir among the descendants of the Hanks family, who are still alive today. For many, the DNA was a source of relief, a way to finally clear away the lies. But for others, it was a loss of status. To find out that you aren't related to the noble Hankses but rather to a group of elusive mountain people is a difficult pill for some to swallow. But this is the power of the genetic revolution. It doesn't care about your feelings or your family pride. It only cares about the sequence of base pairs. As we look at the results from a broader perspective, we see that Abraham Lincoln's mother represents a forgotten segment of our history. The Hanks DNA is a silent witness to the lives of thousands of women who lived and died in the shadows of the great men. The disturbing truth is that we almost lost this story forever. If it hadn't been for a few small samples and some very dedicated scientists, the maternal line of the man who saved the United States would have remained a blank page. It reminds us that history is incredibly fragile. We think of the past as something solid, but it is actually a collection of memories that we choose to keep. The DNA proves that we made a choice to forget the reality of Nancy Hanks's people because they didn't fit the image of what we wanted a president's mother to be. But now, the signature of Nancy is a part of the public record. It shows a connection to the deepest, most ancient parts of the human story. It shows that Lincoln wasn't a fluke. He was the result of a long, painful process of biological and social selection. He was the survivor of survivors. The disturbing results are actually a testament to the incredible resilience of the human spirit. If you can come from a line of people who were legally and socially erased, and you can rise to become the voice of a nation, then anything is possible. The DNA research is ongoing. Every year, as more people around the world take genetic tests, the database grows. We are finding more matches for the Hanks mitochondrial line in unexpected places. Each match is a new clue. We are finding links to small villages in Western Ireland and isolated communities in North Carolina. We are slowly piecing together the broken mirror of Nancy's ancestry. But the core of the discovery remains. She was a woman of the other America. She was a daughter of the wilderness in a way that goes beyond just living in a cabin. Her very genes were forged in the fire of the American fringe. This is why the story matters. In an age where we are often divided by labels, Lincoln's DNA tells us that the greatest among us was himself, a mixture of the very things we fight about. He was a man of the people, because his DNA was the DNA of the people we tried to forget. He carried the markers of the marginalized, the poor, and the obscure. The disturbing reality of his mother's ancestry is that it proves Lincoln was a true man of the soil, not in a poetic sense, but in a literal biological sense. Think about the silence of the woods where Nancy Hanks Lincoln is buried. There is no grand monument like the one in Washington, D.C. There is just a simple stone in a quiet park in Indiana. For a long time, that silence was all we had. But the DNA has broken that silence. It has shouted out a history of struggle and complexity that we are only now beginning to understand. It is a story that involves more than just a name on a page. It involves the movement of ancient peoples, the mixing of cultures in the mountain mist, and the birth of a child who would change the world. As we conclude this deep dive into the genetic heart of the Lincoln family, we have to ask ourselves, are we ready for what else the DNA might tell us? If we find out more about his father's line, or the lines of other founding fathers, will we be able to handle it? The genetic revolution is changing our relationship with the past. It is making it more personal, more messy, and much more interesting. The disturbing revelation about Nancy Hanks is just the beginning. We are finally peering into the real nature of our ancestors, and what we are finding is much more spectacular and much more human than anything we find in the history books. Abraham Lincoln once said, "All that I am, or hope to be, I owe to my angel mother." We used to think that was just a sentimental tribute, but in light of the DNA evidence, it takes on a much deeper meaning. He owed her his life, his appearance, and perhaps even his unique perspective on the human condition. He owed her the strength of a lineage that knew how to survive the impossible. He was her greatest achievement, the one who finally made the world look at the Hanks name and see not a source of shame, but a source of salvation. The disturbing secret wasn't a crime or a scandal. It was simply the truth of how difficult it was to be a human being on the edge of the world. Nancy Hanks carried that truth in her cells, and she passed it to her son. He carried it to the White House, and he used it to forge a new future for all of us. When we look at that DNA, we aren't just looking at the mother of a president. We are looking at ourselves. We are looking at the complicated, beautiful, and often unsettling reality of the American people. And that is a story worth telling, word by word, generation by generation, until the last secret is finally brought into the light. The study of the Hanks DNA serves as a reminder that every one of us carries a library of information within. We are all walking history books. Sometimes the most important chapters are the ones that someone tried to rip out. But the code remains. The mitochondrial DNA of Nancy Hanks survived her, it survived her son, and it survives in her distant cousins today. It is a golden thread of continuity in a world of constant change. If this story has shown us anything, it is that we should never be afraid of what we find when we dig deep. Whether we are digging into the earth to build a grand project or digging into the genome to find our roots, the truth is always more valuable than the myth. The disturbing ancestry of Nancy Hanks is a gift to our understanding of Abraham Lincoln. It makes him more real, more relatable, and more heroic. He didn't just overcome the challenges of his time. He overcame the challenges of his own blood. And in doing so, he showed us that we are not defined by where we come from, but by where we decide to go. So the next time you see the Lincoln Memorial, or you look at a penny, think about Nancy. Think about the woman whose DNA was a mystery for a century. Think about the people of the Appalachian frontier and the hidden heritages that make up the backbone of this country. The science has given us a new way to see them. It has given us a way to honor the invisible people who made the visible world possible. The DNA has revealed the truth, and while it might be unsettling to some, to those who love the real story of humanity, it is absolutely genius. Nancy's story is a reminder that we are still in the early days of understanding our own history. We are like explorers standing on the edge of a vast, dark forest. We have our lanterns and our maps, but the forest is deep and full of surprises. Mitochondrial DNA is one of our best lanterns. It allows us to see a few steps ahead into the darkness. And as we move forward, we should be prepared to be shocked, disturbed, and ultimately enlightened. Because in the end, the history of America isn't just a series of dates and battles. It is a story of families, of movement, and of the incredible power of the genetic legacy that connects us all to the very first people who ever stepped into the wilderness. Abraham Lincoln's mother has finally come home to history. She is no longer just a shadow or a rumor. She is a woman with a genetic signature, a lineage, and a place in the story of the world. The scientists have done their work, and now it is up to us to listen to what the DNA has told us. It is a story of survival, of secrecy, and of the ultimate triumph of a single line of code that refused to be erased. This is the real Lincoln legend, and it is more powerful than anything we ever could have made up.